Sri Lanka and Lebanon. The two countries are a world apart, yet they share a similar story, one of political turmoil and violence that has led to their economic collapse. Their economies were once prosperous, but both the countries had a deadly combination of corruption and incompetence. And this led to a disaster for both. The signs are quite similar. Currency collapse, three-digit inflation, long queues for gas and food, and a decimated middle class. There isn't one moment that could have predicted this catastrophic collapse, but the signs have been there for months, even years. The roots of the crisis lying in decades of corruption and conflict. Both Sri Lanka and Lebanon suffered a long civil war. After that, both of them had a rocky recovery. The countries were mostly dominated by corrupt warlords, all of whom stubbornly held on to power. In Lebanon, the sectarian power-sharing system has plagued the country since the civil war. It was meant to transition the country into a post-war situation, but what it did was allowed the conflict to persist in Lebanon. The politicians separated their portions of the government, using the money to enrich themselves and their political class. In Sri Lanka, the Rajapaksa family has monopolized politics for decades, and until recently, the entire government was controlled by this one family. They controlled over 75% of the country's budget, and it is the bad decisions by this family that led to the current crisis. So this was what led to the collapse. But how exactly did this happen? In Lebanon, the tipping point was 2019. This was when the government announced new proposed taxes. This led to anger on the streets and mass protests.
Since 2019, Lebanon has suffered an unprecedented economic crisis. It was caused by decades of mismanagement and corruption. Now, the World Bank says that Lebanon is among the world's worst financial crises since the mid-19th century. The state's bankruptcy has hampered imports of basic necessities such as food, fuel, and medicine. Over 80% of the population lives under poverty, and inflation has reached triple digits. Now, Lebanon is in talks with the IMF for aid, but not before the country forms a government. So currently, there is no end in sight for the economic crisis here in the country.
In Sri Lanka, Gotabaya pushed through the largest tax cuts in the country's history that sparked backlash in the island nation. Creditors downgraded the country's ratings, while foreign exchange reserves nosedived.
Sri Lanka's economy has been bruised and battered ever since the devastating Easter Sunday attacks in 2019, which was then preceded by a COVID-19 pandemic and as of right now is facing its worst economic crisis. The only solution in sight as of right now appears to be that of an IMF bailout. But for a bailout to come through, political stability and clean governance is of paramount importance, for which Sri Lanka is still struggling with a political crisis just as much as an economic crisis. As of right now, it appears to be that there is no concrete solution in sight for Sri Lanka's economic crisis.
Before this, both Lebanon and Sri Lanka had a middle-income population. It allowed most people to live somewhat comfortably, but the hardships have transformed everyday life in both countries. Life here may never return to what it was. But Sri Lanka and Lebanon are not alone. Experts say a dozen countries could suffer the same fate. And this includes Egypt, Tunisia, Sudan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. This comes as post-pandemic recovery and the Ukraine war spark global food shortages and inflation. Multiple challenges for the global economy as a result, but these countries specifically under the radar for the economic concerns. Sri Lanka and Lebanon, just a sample of what countries around the world are grappling with. The crisis in Lebanon and Sri Lanka has been called as one of their own making. They have both shared economic troubles, a civil war, and a deepening financial mess, which has now sent alarm bells ringing around the world. And for more on this, with us on the broadcast is Professor Rohan Samrajava, who is the chair of Learn Asia. Thanks very much for being here with us. Talking specifically about Sri Lanka to begin with, the deepening financial crisis there, the fuel stocks running out. What are the options, according to you, that the country has as of now?
What we have is a combined political and economic option, which is, I think, ideally the president would resign and create the pathway for an all-party government, empowering parliament. We would also get through a constitutional amendment that is currently in process that would ideally strip a lot of the power away from the president that was taken from parliament about a year and a half ago. And hopefully that will allow us to negotiate bridge financing, which is the absolute necessity at this time to resolve this problem with the fuel imports.
Right. In Lebanon, over 2 years, around 78% of the population finds itself grappling with poverty. The World Bank has already raised serious concern over this. What is your assessment of the current economic scenario there?
Yeah, we believe that things are bad right now, that about half the population is under stress. So any social safety net, and we've been working quite a bit on the social safety net aspect, we'll really have to broaden the reach of the social safety net. And this is before the water prices have been increased. And these are all things that have to be increased because otherwise there's a danger that our banking system will be affected. The losses in the electric utility are so large at this point. So we really need to get the social safety net working because poverty is a serious issue now. But you see, there are two aspects to this. One is the cost of things, and the other is the availability of things. So right now we are being hit by availability problems, and people are sort of not giving that much importance to the cost. But the cost factors are going to kick in very, very quickly because inflation is now running at over 50%.
Right, and the economic concerns, the parallels between Sri Lanka and Lebanon extending to other countries as well, around a dozen of them could find themselves in a similar situation. We're leaving it there for the moment. Professor, thanks very much for joining us here on the broadcast.
Thank you.
WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.